Good morning, everyone. My name is Jeffrey Ogbar, professor here at the University of Connecticut in the Department of History. Very excited with our first session of the day, Racial Terror and Violence. We have an extraordinary panel of such esteemed scholars. I'm quite excited to be here and enjoy their presentations. We will go in order of the names we see here. Gregory Downs, University of California, Davis, will go first, followed by Crystal Feimster, Yale University, Leanne Keith at Collegiate School, and Kadada Williams at Wayne State. We'll have Q&A following all presentations when they're fully completed. And we will start with Professor Downs. Thank you.
All right, good morning, everybody. I'm really excited to be here and appreciate all of your energy this early in the morning. In 1880, speaking on West Indian emancipation in Elmira, New York, Frederick Douglass rued the collapse of Reconstruction and the triumph of what he saw as the counter-revolution. The old master class is today triumphant, he said. Our Reconstruction measures were radically defective. For Douglass, grief in Reconstruction meant mourning the limits of liberal democracy to transform society or even to protect citizens' rights. He contemplated the gloomy possibility that Reconstruction revealed a flaw not just in American character, though there were plenty of those, but in the American constitutional system. Although Douglass in his speech paid homage to the peaceful transition of West Indian emancipation, he used it to contrast it to what he thought for the usual fate of the world. Great and valuable concessions have in different ages been made to the liberties of mankind, he said. They have, however, come not at the command of reason and persuasion, but by the sharp and terrible edge of the sword. Looking gloomily at conditions in the South with a quite different political angle, former President Ulysses S. Grant about the same time said, "Looking back over the whole policy of Reconstruction, it seems to me that the wisest thing would have been to have continued for some time the military rule. The trouble about military rule in the South was that our people did not like it. It was not in accordance with our institutions." Using these quotes and some of the other work I've done, like other scholars here, I'm interested in using Reconstruction to interrogate the way we think about the nation's history. Not working as a constitutional historian myself, maybe as an anti-constitutional historian, by examining the historical inadequacy of the Constitution and of the founding generation. For Douglass and Grant each pointed to two intertwined issues that I'll discuss briefly and in broad terms today. First, that Reconstruction had been a genuine revolution, meaning that it did achieve fundamental, some ways permanent transformation of a political economic order by, and this is crucial to my definition, the way they thought about it at that point, forcible, violent, extra-constitutional methods. Rather than proving that the Constitution was open to change, it seemed to prove the opposite. Although revolution often centers, discussion of revolution generally, often centers on either origins or outcomes, I follow more recent social scientific methods that emphasize methods, the methods that explain how the second founding that Eric Foner addressed last night came into being. And I will also use this paper to reflect upon another aspect of their separate late 1870s despair. A return to normal government, a return to constitutionalism, came to seem by definition a finish of the revolutionary moment. And so at the end of my talk, I'll reflect on why we still call Reconstruction an unfinished revolution and why maybe we should stop. I should say there's nothing new about calling the Civil War era a revolution. Journalists and politicians did so even before Fort Sumter, and many Civil War and Reconstruction historians have used that language either in praise of the transformative impact, especially on African Americans, or in discussion of the transformation of the United States economic system. Interestingly and worryingly, as John Witt referred to yesterday, the historians who most frequently investigated revolutionary methods, forcible and violent, were not champions of Reconstructions, but bitter critics like William Dunning and Claude Bowers, who denounced bayonet rule, martial law, and other violent methods used to remake the South and the Constitution. Current historians have, over the last half century or more, overturned that bleak judgment of Reconstruction, but often at the expense of underemphasizing those methods. What I aim to do is to reevaluate those methods not as a way of denouncing them, but as a way of capturing their necessity. Republicans turned to military power, to force, in order to revolutionize Southern society and remake the Constitution. I'll take the two pieces in order, the methods and then the effort at permanent transformation. To retell the methods that Republicans used, of course, is to risk retelling the history of the Civil War and Reconstruction to a room of historians of the Civil War and Reconstruction. So I'll just point out things that we all know but sometimes can sit as the sort of obstacles in the road that we drive along. The methods began, of course, with temporary wartime assertions of martial law in Maryland and Virginia, then the rest of the occupied Confederacy, pressed forward by the actions of enslaved people who made their case at Fort Monroe and then other bases. And then this was expanded over 1862 into a more permanent attack on slavery. To achieve this, Congress immediately began not only to move beyond a temporary suspension of peacetime powers for a temporary move into wartime, but permanent reconfiguration, most notably by the still sort of underappreciated, in my mind, obviously extra-constitutional effort to Russia and West Virginia. A permanent transformation in the midst of crisis that warned even Lyman Trumbull that it was improper to permanently remake the nation in the midst of crisis. In 1864, empowered by this, Republicans created Nevada and tried to bring in Colorado and Nebraska, specifically, James Ashley said, to game the Electoral College. As I write in After Appomattox, those methods endured after Confederate surrender, as is shown on a digital site that Scott Nesbitt and I did called Mapping Occupation. As Grant, Andrew Johnson, and the cabinet rejected the idea of peace in order to sustain war powers and expand the occupation of the South over roughly 630 outposts across the South. Of course, interactions between the Army and the freed people at these sites were varied, sometimes oppressive and sometimes horrifying. If you're interested in following this, if you can click on the other tab, you can see this is the map. The first has a narrative. And then if you see the play button down there, you can follow the movement of the Army and different units of the Army, cavalry, USCT, et cetera. Of course, those interactions between the Army were varied, sometimes oppressive, sometimes horrifying. My point is not the Army had good intentions. My argument is that the Army's presence and the continuing force of war powers created a potential countervailing force, one that could displace local officials, arrest and displace judges and sheriffs, a force that, of course, did not teach freed people about freedom, something they well knew, but aimed to teach planters about freedom. What then made these temporary wartime suspensions a permanent transformation? Because I would agree that wartime itself is not a revolution. Why a permanent transformation? In my forthcoming book, The Second American Revolution, I turn the study of the occupation from my previous book outward and back to Washington. The explicit goal of congressional Republicans became to utilize military authority to permanently remake the country. Congress sustained those methods and extended revolutionary time in December 1865 by excluding Confederate states, and this fragment of a Congress then extended the Freedmen's Bureau, passed the Civil Rights Act that seemed to go beyond existing constitutional authority. Senator Lott Morrill said, "I admit the species of legislation, the CRA, is absolutely revolutionary, but are we not in the midst of a revolution?" And then the 14th Amendment, which passed a Congress that excluded 11 out of 36 states. When ex-Confederate states rejected the amendment, of course, Congress then put those states back under military rule and ordered the Army to register black male adult residents and create new state constitutions. Of the 14th Amendment, only 19 non-Confederate states ratified it and sustained their ratifications, and 3 of those 19 had been added during the war by fractional and Reconstruction by fractional Congresses, meaning they were well short, absent martial law and the wartime gaming, of the necessary 28. The remaining votes came from states under military rule. You cannot find an instance where so great a revolution has been wrought, crowed, not complained, Alabama Republican Senator Willard Warner. When Ulysses S. Grant was elected president in 1868, the decidedly unradical New York Herald called it the crowning point of our Second American Revolution, as the United States was changed utterly by the expurgation of the old Constitution founded upon slavery. Grant then, in their terms, would complete the work of making a new Constitution by forcing the last few rebel states to ratify the 15th Amendment under threat of martial law. On the 15th Amendment, Republicans again relied on 6 states previously restored under military rule, plus 4 more states sustained under military rule in 1869, plus the new states added by the fractional Congress. To protect these changes, Republicans relied not just on war powers, but other seemingly norm-shattering efforts. When the Supreme Court threatened them, they sheared away its power, first expanding it, then retracting it. Eliminating when the Supreme Court threatened to take up cases on Reconstruction, the Congress eliminated its jurisdiction over those cases and defied them to take them up. When pressed on this, John Bingham said, well, if they take them up, we'll just pass a constitutional amendment eliminating the Supreme Court forever. To get to their supermajorities, Republicans expelled a sitting senator and added the state of Nebraska. So now there are some important caveats we should point out. Republicans found justifications for many of these actions in the Constitution and in the rules of Congress. And so some Republicans always insisted they were not operating as revolutionaries. But over the 1860s, a surprising number, including those who would later deny it, did in fact turn to revolutionary explanations. Most civil progress has been through bloody revolution, Republican Congressman Ulysses Mercer said. It seems to require a violent upheaval of society, echoing Douglas's language in the 1880. Other Republicans compared the Civil War, including those like James Garfield, compared the Civil War era to the French Revolution and Britain's Glorious Revolution. And of course, Democrats compared it to all kinds of revolutionary moments and complaint. It was a period that opened up for them a period of constitutional originality, not originalism, that we seem to have lost in the country. Along with the 3 amendments, 350 constitutional amendments were proposed in Congress between 1865 and 1871, including, of course, alleged moderate John Bingham's suggested, though never contemplated, amendment to eliminate the Supreme Court. So that's one caveat. They often said they were not revolutionaries, though this itself is breaking down over the course of the war. Another, of course, lies in the limits of revolution. If revolution is an ideal type reaching a utopia, then obviously Reconstruction wasn't for 2 reasons. One of which is that it was never a utopia. Feminists who argued for women's suffrage were bitterly disappointed, as were those labor activists who hoped for property redistribution, freed people for property redistribution in the South, and others who hoped for a transformation of working conditions across the country. Like every other revolution, the Second American Revolution did not change everything, nor intend to. This makes it in league with other revolutions not unlike. But the more significant caveat comes less in the piece that lies in the piece that connects to my second point about a finished revolution. Republicans, by and large, did not imagine themselves in a state of permanent revolution. They were not, by and large, utopians. They wanted to move into revolutionary time for a defined period in order to remake the Constitution and then exit back to peacetime, exactly what John Witt lamented yesterday. This may reflect their moderation. It also, I think, reflects their concrete wariness about the history of revolutions. Their complaints about the French Revolution and others were not often that they weren't too radical, but that they failed. And that revolutions that could not find an exit and sustained revolutionary time too long ended up falling prey to counter-revolution. Now, as we know, the Republicans did not solve that problem either, and that on the ground, the counter-revolution began immediately as it started, and freed people and military commanders fought an ongoing revolution against planners for control of state government, forcibly evicting governors in several states and overruling law in others. During the well-organized counter-revolution of 1868 to 1875, Southern Democrats overthrew Southern governments, and then a Democratic Party determined to shear away military power at the national level took control of Congress between 1875 and 1880. Thus, by 1880, Reconstruction appeared, as Douglas and Grant said in different ways, to be a finished revolution. Not because it had accomplished everything anyone wanted, but because the revolutionary period and the powers it had created had passed. It had emerged in a period when extra legal force could override legal limits. They hoped then to reach a stable state to preserve the gains of Reconstruction without risking a tyrannical military power forever, but in fact in a dilemma that they have not escaped. Military power turned out to be a necessary, if deeply problematic, method in order to achieve those rights. So the revolution was not complete, if that's what we mean by an unfinished revolution, if we judge it against our aspirations or even theirs. But it was complete as a historical period. Wartime ended, normalcy resumed. And that normalcy was perilously akin, though not exactly to, the normalcy that existed before the war. And the unfinished revolution model has helped us think through many problems of Reconstruction, including those gaps between intentions and effects. And it inspired Eric Foner's masterwork, the single greatest volume on Reconstruction ever written. But I wonder if we're nearing the end of the phrase's utility. For to think of Reconstruction as a finished revolution asks us to think of it as a part of history, not as a prelude to a civil rights movement that in many ways continues to shadow and to overdetermine the history of Reconstruction. And thus, this may help 20th century people, who I'm not, so I'm free to give advice to, think of the transformations of the 1930s to 1960s as the product of a different historical moment entirely, one that sometimes utilized the language of the second revolution of Reconstruction, but that could have, and perhaps should have, proceeded in other ways. The notion of an unfinished revolution then may prevent us from seeing clearly Reconstruction as an era itself rather than a mirror. An unfinished revolution threatens to become a set of wishes, an unrealized and definitionally unrealizable ideal. And it threatens not to become a revolution at all. And so that even though scholars and historians have used Second Revolution repeatedly, including many in this room, including me, it's striking to me that we have had virtually no impact even upon both upon the public, but also upon social scientists, who in their studies of revolution virtually never include the Civil War or Reconstruction. And in part, I think it's because of a fuzziness about what we mean, whether we mean a transformation or something else. The unfinished revolution then helps us, then in some ways distracts us from a clarity of definition. Clarity that I think we can achieve by focusing upon a set of methods and a set of outcomes that are in a process that completes. So the unfinished revolution risks encouraging scholars to have their cake and eat it too, to want all the gains of the revolutionary period without confronting the fact that many of those gains depended upon shattering norms and relying on martial law, depended on things that might in this moment shock us. To think of the constitutional revolutions we have discussed as a genuine revolution, as one rooted in blunt force and irregular procedures, is to ask precisely what lessons Reconstruction teaches, especially about the evergreen effort to discover historical meanings of the amendments that might ideally solve contemporary political problems. Does Reconstruction suggest, as scholars sometimes hopefully argue, the possibility of popular constitutional reinvention, the way the United States can and perhaps always is remaking itself? Or should instead Reconstruction, seen as a finished revolution, as a defined era, lead us to reflect upon the difficulty of creating significant change through normal constitutional methods? If the way to fix the Constitution was to rule through martial law, dismiss the Supreme Court, and in many ways shatter all kinds of norms, should we be more concerned than we are about the nation's normal capacity to defend rights, protect its institutions, or enact transformative change through normal procedures? And should we be more skeptical about our hopes that proper Reconstruction will help establish a dependable foundation for better constitutional judgments by the Supreme Court? Is one lesson of Reconstruction as a finished revolution that we should invest fewer hopes in courts and look instead to a different model, Republicans' 1860s willingness to violate constitutional norms in order to achieve goals that they believed in, as inspiration for ourselves to be bolder about not working within the rules of the game and calling for the refs as they're violated, but changing the rules of the game, to follow their Reconstruction by creating new states, new amendments, a new constitution that might work better for the new United States.
Good morning. First of all, I'd like to thank Manisha for organizing the conference and including me in the conversation. Without question, Louisiana is central to the history of Reconstruction. It was in Louisiana where Southern women, black and white, first challenged the sexual violence of occupation and Reconstruction. It was where fugitives of slavery violently resisted the attempts of federal forces and local and civil authorities to limit their mobility and keep them enslaved on plantations. It was in Louisiana that some of the first African-American regiments mustered into the Union Army. It was where the first black troops were put to the test of battle. It was in Louisiana that enslaved people experimented with strikes and bargaining before and after Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation failed to emancipate the enslaved people of Louisiana. It was there as early as 1862 that the first contract wage system was implemented on Southern plantations. It was in Louisiana that the question of black male suffrage gained currency and exposed the limits of Lincoln's 10% plan. It was in the state it was the state that was on Lincoln's mind when he made his last public speech on April 11th, 1865. Indeed, according to Eric Foner, it was Louisiana that Lincoln invested the greatest hopes, I'm quoting here, invested the greatest hopes and suffered the greatest disappointments. It was the New Orleans race riot of July 1866 that helped to instigate a shift towards radical Reconstruction and passage of the Reconstruction Act of 1867. It was the setting of the Colfax Massacre of Easter 1873, in which 60 freedmen were murdered, setting in motion the United States versus Cruikshank, which tested the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 72. It was out of Louisiana that the 1873 Slaughterhouse case resulted in a landmark U.S. Supreme Court decision limiting the protection of privileges and the immunities clause of the 14th Amendment. And finally, it was in Louisiana that black soldiers and laundresses mutinied against their white Union officers. And that's what I want to talk about today. But without question, the wartime Reconstruction in Louisiana from 1862 to 1865 influenced the nation's eventual commitment to freedom and its reluctant promise of equality. But it also foreshadowed the racial and sexual violence that ultimately toppled radical Reconstruction and the federal government's eventual abandonment of black people in the rebellious states. So I want to start with the mutiny. The mutiny is one of the kind of chapters in my book to try to get us to rethink Reconstruction through Louisiana and actually centering on the violent battles between black people and the military, but also how the black people and women used the military to negotiate their own understandings of freedom and rights and equal protection under the law. December 1863, Fort Jackson. General William Dwight retreated to his quarters at Fort Jackson and carefully penned a 6-page letter to his mother. He recounted in painstaking detail the mutiny at Fort Jackson, a Mississippi River garrison almost 70 miles south of New Orleans that had compelled General Nathaniel Banks, commander of the Department of the Gulf, to issue orders for him to take temporary command of the fort. I was ordered down here to assume command, to enforce discipline, to arrest the ringleaders of the riot, he explained. In short, to deal with the difficult case, I was given white troops with which to force matters, if need be, with the edge of the sword. On December 9, 1863, only a day after Lincoln had issued his proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction, the 4th Regiment of the Louisiana Native Guard, also known as the 4th Corps d'Afrique, took up arms against their white officers after Lieutenant Colonel Benedict whipped Harry Williams and Monroe Miller, members of the regimental band, for attempting to leave the grounds of the fort without permission. The simple fact, explained to White, was that the lieutenant colonel took a whip and with his own hands savagely beat 2 of the Negro soldiers. And after news of the beating had spread, the soldiers broke out into open mutiny. Half of the regiment rushed onto the parade ground, seized and beat some of the officers, and shot their muskets into the air as an open threat. Others released the prisoners confined in the guardhouse and went in search of the lieutenant colonel to kill him. And throughout the mutiny, they sort of shouted out that they knew their rights, and they knew that the adjutant general had told them that they weren't supposed to be flogged. They knew that the military had outlawed whipping a year before, and they had kept saying they didn't come here to be beaten. It took almost an hour for the white officers to convince the black soldiers to put down their weapons and return to their quarters. Indeed, they only did so after being promised that justice would be had and that Benedict would be removed from the fort. The primary cause of the mutiny, concluded Dwight, and I quote, was a foolish and passionate lieutenant colonel who so little understood his character as an officer as to raise his own hand against a soldier, and who had no more sense than to put the lash to the Negro, whose idea of freedom is that he is raised by it beyond the pale of that worst degradation of servitude. Indeed, here lay the crux of the issue, the gap between the Negro's idea of freedom and white Union officers' ideas about free black manhood in the aftermath of slavery. Immediately following Benedict's departure the next morning, 10 of the regiment's company first sergeants presented a written request for an interview with Colonel Drew. They wanted the colonel to know that their actions were a direct response to the conduct, I quote, the conduct of Lieutenant Colonel Benedict, and not anything against him or their government. Moreover, they promised to go with him to the end if he will look to our rights. The black soldiers made clear that they knew their rights and insisted that they be protected. The soldiers understood, even if their white officers did not, that they had rights as freed men and as Union soldiers, that they were no longer slaves who could be whipped mercilessly without consequences. Banks sent a commission to investigate the mutiny before eventually ordering a court-martial of the ringleaders of the mutiny and also of the Lieutenant Colonel Benedict. For 2 days, the commission took testimony from the white officers, but did not call any black soldiers to testify. And also the transcripts of the mutiny in which black soldiers were able to testify have actually disappeared from the archives. Nobody's been able to find them. There's a summary, but there's no, you don't have the full transcript of the actual court-martial. So most people are working from that summary and then the commission report. The commission report left little doubt that Benedict was mostly responsible. Summarizing the commission's findings, Banks concluded the punishment of which the men were subject for a considerable length of time before the revolt was contrary to the rules of war and contrary to the orders constantly given in the department. In defense of the soldiers, Banks reasoned it must be considered that a great many of the duties of citizens which are readily understood and accepted by white men are not by them understood and appreciated. A few months' instruction and discipline is not sufficient to enable them to comprehend all that is required of citizens or soldiers. He added, it is unreasonable to expect that men who have never handled a musket, who have never been admitted to civil or individual rights, can instantaneously become perfect soldiers, and concluded, the commission is of the opinion that the conduct of the men was more owing to an ignorance of their rights and the proper means of redress than to any preconcerted plan of revolt. It was much easier for Banks to believe that the mutiny reflected a failure on the part of black troops to understand their rights, rather than acknowledging that the black soldiers understood the rebellion as an exercise of their rights as freed men. To do so would require the white officers to accept black soldiers' ideas about freedom, ideas that allowed them to defend themselves against white violence and consider themselves as equals. January 1864, Fort Jackson. This is about a week after the court-martial, when 10 of the black soldiers were court-martialed and found guilty of mutiny, and the white officer was found to be also derelict of duties and engaging in improper and violent action against the soldiers, was also cashiered, basically. So about a week after the court-martial, in an 8-page letter to Banks dated January 27th, Dwight reported in great detail his arrest of 2 captains and 2 lieutenants for attempting to sexually assault at least 4 laundresses in the contraband quarters attached to the post. Dwight explained in his letter that these women and the soldiers who live in their vicinity, as well as the soldiers who have from time to time for the months past been placed on posts near these contraband quarters, all concur in stating that scenes similar to the one of Monday evening have been of frequent, almost nightly occurrences for a long time past, that other officers than those arrested have been at other times equally guilty, so that the names of many officers have been held up to the scandal and contempt of the soldiers of the regiment. And Dwight had arrested 4 white officers who had attempted to assault the laundresses in the contraband quarters after the laundresses protested and actually physically fought back. It was this, if this was the case, the determination of the black soldiers to defend and also a couple of the black soldiers came out to help defend the women against the assaults. The determination of black soldiers to defend their female relations may have been an important causal factor in the Fort Jackson mutiny that had happened just a month before. Dwight concluded that the disgusting details of the late affair rendered it unfit for the investigation of a military tribunal. He reasoned a court-martial would bring more negative publicity and further injure the reputation of a most important corps of the service. Moreover, he argued that the only witnesses to be produced against commissioned officers would be Negro women of more than questionable character, and the Negro soldiers who stand in terror of all who have exercised authority over them and inherited terror, increased by an average of 20 years of personal bondage and only to be eradicated by the influence of time and the elevation of freedom. Making use of racist stereotypes and misconceptions about slavery and its impact on black womanhood and manhood, Dwight sought to bypass a military trial that would bring more negative attention to the officers of the 4th Regiment. He just wanted to basically not have a court-martial, but have the guys dishonorably discharged. He believed they were guilty and they should be kicked out of the regiment. Without question, the sexual violence that occurred in the camp encapsulated some of the tensions that were associated with the rape of enslaved women by white men in the antebellum period. On the plantation and in camp, rape was more than a vehicle for sexual gratification. The white officers of the Native Guard may have employed rape as a weapon of psychological intimidation and revenge. The regiment had a history of sexual assaults, but these attacks appeared to have increased in intensity immediately after the mutiny and court-martial of Lieutenant Benedict. The rule of military law had triumphed as a result of the mutiny. Lieutenant Colonel Benedict was dismissed from the service. However, a legacy of recrimination and unease lingered. Racist officers may have felt an even greater need to assert their authority over the men and women to teach them a lesson, lest they forget their place. The sexual harassment of the laundresses may have been a means to this end. The white officers may have sought to dramatize the hierarchies of powers to communicate a message of defeat. The attacks failed. Not only did the women fight back on the night of the 25th, no doubt encouraged by the mutiny and the black soldiers' success at ridding the regiment of Benedict, but they also testified before a military commission against their assailants. On February 3rd, the commission, after mature deliberation on the evidence, completed and submitted its official report to Dwight. The report revealed the women's courage and determination to resist sexual assault. And in this report, I do actually have the women's testimonies. And for the first time, they were able to assert their legal claim to personal and sexual autonomy. Speaking out in their own defense, they claimed their rights as citizens and as women worthy of protection. Denied legal protection against rape under slavery, the laundresses challenged long-held beliefs that black women welcomed white men's sexual advances. The case of mutiny and rape at Fort Jackson is an extraordinary example of not only how black men and women articulated their rights in the context of war and Reconstruction, but also how they insisted on equal protection before military law. Thank you.
I'm just so honored to be here. If you look at this panel, right, one of these things is not like the others, and I have to think that I got a little bit of a favorable nod as a graduate of UConn's History PhD program, and so I'm very grateful to Professor Sinha for making me the teacher's pet today, and also to my former professors and friends who are here today, Dick Brown, Frank Castigliola, and Kent Newmeyer, so thanks for coming. I'm going to talk to you today about violence used in the pursuit of political goals by Democrats. But before I start to bash on the Democrats, I want to make clear that the Republicans started it. And as my colleague here, Greg Downs, has said, they move heaven and earth in pursuit of their political goals using not just a healthy dose of force and violence, but the most profound violence in the history of the United States in the service of their goals. And that goes back to the founding era of the Republican Party, which is something that I've been studying, and I have taken note of a violent disposition among Republicans going back to, well, beginning with the Kansas troubles, right? When Republicans staged an armed immigration, when they engaged in stockpiling weapons, when they developed a national fundraising network that would allow them to build up militias, anti-slavery militias in the Kansas setting, and provide them not only with rifles, but also in the case of a small howitzer provided by Frederick Law Olmsted to the Kansas folks with a cannon that actually was employed in the struggles with the enemies of the anti-slavery Kansans, and even used in the early confrontations of the Civil War. So violence in pursuit of political goals is really written into the DNA of the Republican Party. Republicans also become deeply engaged with John Brown, which his movement is an outgrowth of the Kansas Troubles. And it's clear that Republicans developed huge enthusiasm for Brown, although he never reciprocated, right? He always felt like Republicans were cravens who were afraid to take the war into Africa. And yet Republicans assist Brown in his conspiracy. And if you take a look at the so-called Secret Six, 5 of those have very direct ties to the Republican Party as organizers and partisans. These men and women helped to raise money for Brown, no questions asked, from rank-and-file Republicans across the North, East and West. And the failure of Brown's conspiracy at Harper's Ferry doesn't stop their engagement with John Brownism, right? Some of the most important conspirators, like George L. Stearns, remain committed to the Kansas militia movement, and they begin to plan and even boast about the idea that having secured Kansas as a free state, they're going to use their militias there to raid plantations and disestablish slavery in Missouri, in Texas, and in Indian country. Once Brown was executed, Republicans and their allies celebrate his example of heroic sacrifice in a way that helps to initiate the Civil War, helps to goad Southerners into secession. Henry Thoreau, who like Brown doesn't care much for Republicans, but who spends an awful lot of time with them, he says of Brown's execution that it advertised to him that there was such a thing as death, right? And in fact, that prefigures the sacrifice of generations in the Civil War. The Civil War, of course, is the preeminent example of the use of violence for political ends in the name of emancipation, and later of arming African Americans and elevating the men anyway to the status of full citizens of the United States. This was achieved at the cost of hundreds of thousands of human lives. And even as war ended, they continue to use force for political goals, putting to good effect provost marshals' proceedings or the military tribunals of the Freedmen's Bureau, to mete out punishment to their political enemies, including corporal punishment and incarceration. And the use of the Army to register voters after 1867 should also be acknowledged as the application of force to political ends. And even though we can't say that it's anti-democratic, we can take note of the way that U.S. troops accompany African American voters to the polls on election day demonstrations, the way the Army is used to register voters. And so when it comes to the use of force toward political ends, the Republicans set the stage, right? But Democrats proved themselves to be very able students of these tactics and innovators, in fact, and they distinguished themselves by their willingness to use political assassination and other violence directed against individuals in ways that Republicans had done only on a small scale. So today I want to talk to you about the way Democrats engaged in anti-democratic electioneering. And I have to say that it's a problem of just too many examples, right? Looking over the great works produced by people in this room, people who've already left, people who are coming later today, you'll find no shortage of examples, as everyone knows here, of the use of violence in the pursuit of redemption in the South and home rule. But I want to focus on just one, or actually I want to bring most of my examples from just one case, the 1874 elections in Alabama. That was Alabama's redemption election. And in that election, the Democratic tactics sustained by a national fundraising campaign were to interfere with campaigns and with candidacies, to engage in balloting irregularities, to destabilize the voting process itself, and then also to interfere as Republicans sought to take office and hold office. That these three forms of anti-democratic electioneering were central to the process of redemption in Alabama, which I'm using as a stand-in for so many other places in the Civil War. Talk first about the money, right? White Southerners came under intense pressure to make contributions to a campaign chest, rich or poor. It was a measure of your commitment to the goals, the shared goals of white supremacy, for you to make contributions. And these were supplemented by donations from Northern Democrats and also from industrialists in the North interested in making investments in Alabama enterprises. At the end, or by the onset of the campaign season, they had amassed the largest campaign chest in the history of Alabama, and they put that money to good use. Sometimes by traditional means, like, for example, they commissioned caricatures of the prominent Alabama Republicans, including African-American office holders, and had those printed onto posters and distributed around the state with instructions that Democrats should paper over any Republican campaign materials with these ugly images. They also produce a lot of other campaign printed matter, including some that directly threatened violence, like a pamphlet that was circulated in the shape of a coffin with a text inside explaining to black voters how they could take a pledge not to vote for Republicans or to refrain from voting in the 1874 elections. And it included the phrase, the motto, sign or die. They do also use their money in new ways. One sort of creative, more fun than usual Democratic tactic was the employment of brass band to disrupt one Republican event in Union Springs, Alabama, during the campaign, drowning out the speakers. In another incident, they actually charter a whole train excursion of Democrats and their families turn out at a Republican rally, everyone equipped with their own tin horn, for drowning out the speeches. So they have some innovative ways to use their money. But of course, what makes them famous, notorious, is the way that they interfered with the campaigns and with the candidacies of Republicans. Again, some of this is not violent, but is corrupt in other ways. As, for example, when they obtained the complicity of Republican officials by payments. Right? One case from 1874 had a black Alabama office holder agree to distribute invalid ballots to his supporters in exchange for $300 in cash. They also cultivated independent candidates, including sometimes a second African-American candidate to enter the field and divide the black vote. But violence was a mainstay, right? It was not possible in 1874 to have a Republican Party meeting, right? And this is not particular to Alabama or to 1874, right? And sort of the overrunning of political meetings, the turning out of participants, beating men and women, open assassinations. That's the bread and butter of redemption, as we know. Sometimes they engaged at violence a step below that, right, with sort of rowdy mobs, tomato throwing, rotten eggs, and of course threats against speakers coming in from outside the particular localities, right? If you try to bring in your celebrity speakers, they'll be warned not to come into that county because you won't come out. And their most important tool in discouraging the candidacies of Republicans and attaching a high price to political participation was social ostracism on the one hand and economic intimidation on the other, right? And it became a signature of the Republican experience in Reconstruction and afterward that you need a government job if you're going to make a living, because you won't be able to trade or engage in normal economic activities with your hostile neighbors. Fraud and intimidation at the polls is also a well-known tactic. Some of this, again, fell below the standard of actual violence. Trick ballots were a feature of the Alabama 1874 elections. In one case in this period, they print up a ballot. The Republicans had made a ballot with a perforated top in order to, reassure illiterate voters that they were voting for the right party. Democrats respond predictably with their own perforated top ballot. In these days they circulate ballots that you can bring with you to the polls, and they just substitute Democratic names for the Republicans. Or in another case, even more egregious, they print up ballots that have the names of Democratic candidates, but portraits of famous Republicans in the state, including also a portrait of U.S. Grant. More sensational were armed demonstrations at the polls, Election Day riots. The worst of these took place in Barber County in South Alabama, where on Election Day, hundreds of armed white men come into town firing liberally. They kill 7, they wound 70, and they keep thousands of black men from voting. And they're not satisfied with that, right? But they have to go on to commit egregious acts of ballot box tampering. In one effort to seize a ballot box, Democrats fire upon their neighbor and kill his 16-year-old son in cold blood, and then have the man, a Republican official, watch as they burn the ballot box. The Barber County fever becomes an Alabama shorthand for disrupting elections by these kinds of violent acts. I have to admit that I have not found examples from Alabama's election of interruption in the process of taking office and holding office. But the most famous example of this, of course, is the Colfax Massacre, which, as now you all know this, I think, and have known this disputed election result in 1872 leads to 2 sets of claimants for all the offices in the state. On the ground, this was a struggle for control of buildings, right? In New Orleans, which was then the capital, Republicans get control of buildings, but not so in Grant Parish, where Democrats form a militia, invade the town, and kill, by their own estimate, 167 black men, and burn their own courthouse down to the ground. So how do the Democrats justify these cruel and criminal acts, How could the Democrats of the 19th century be so low down? And to me, this is a question that has some contemporary relevance. And I don't have a direct answer to this question, right? But I do think that it has to do with the perception of the stakes, right, in the 1874 election and Reconstruction as a whole. They said it's a choice between white supremacy and black supremacy. And Democrats in that electioneering actually make it clear that when they talk about white supremacy, they're not only talking about subordinating black people to the rule of white elites, but that they assert the supremacy of whites and Protestants overall, individuals in Alabama. During the campaign, the sitting Alabama senator, a guy named John Tyler Morgan, actually makes a speech in which he refers to a Republican office holder as a dog of a Jew. And he even says, sort of nonsensically as I can see it, he's not even a Hebrew of the Hebrews, but an Ishmaelite of the Ishmaelites. And he also say to black voters in one incident that you will vote with us or we will exterminate you, as we did the poor Indians. Right? I want to say that they had incredible success with this movement in the immediate term, overturning Reconstruction, and by some measures we can also say in the long term, right, of asserting the prerogatives of white supremacy into the 20th century and today.
Good morning. Thank you for coming. I research African American survivors' efforts to communicate the hard, fast nature of racial atrocity during Reconstruction and its slow attritional toll. Today, I want to talk about African Americans' descriptions of surviving night riding strikes, and these testimonies are at the Klan hearings, with the hope of challenging scholarly arguments about free will, choice, and agency, and presumptions about their universality and static nature, even during life-threatening situations. I do this because survivors' accounts reveal a full range of responses to white terror. By analyzing 4 strikes relayed at the Klan hearings through the lens of critical trauma studies, which relies on ethnographic, psychological, and neuroscientific research, I hope to provoke a discussion about appreciating a broader spectrum of Black people's responses to this violence. And since I have a captive audience, addressing what I see as some scholars' denial, not about the violence occurring or its political or legal consequences or causes, but about the historical significance of the many elements of distress that survivors testify to experiencing themselves and witnessing in others. One of the more troubling aspects of Night Riders' work was the fact that they invaded their targets' homes, held their families hostage, while they whipped, raped, tortured, and killed them. Most attacked people's testimonies indicate that if they had any choices in how they responded to or protected themselves and their loved ones from harm, they were often diabolical ones, which I think merits consideration when historians talk about individual and family responses to white terror raids. Organized groups of armed white men came 3 times for Lewis Jackson in 1870. Jackson was a veteran who served in the 40th U.S. Colored Infantry and who lived in Stevenson, Alabama. The first time, a posse of up to 100 men staged a blitz raid, snatching Lewis during a roundup of suspects sought for allegedly shooting into the home of a white man. Surprise made it easy for the men to take Lewis before they eventually released him shortly thereafter. The second time, only 3 men arrived outside of the Jackson home and ordered Lewis outside. When he refused, they threatened to come in on him. "If you come into my house, you will not go out," Lewis warned. The 3 men retreated, and Lewis fired off a round, underscoring his readiness to fight and kill. Lewis' actions prompted a final visit, this time of about 25 men. Lewis knew he might be attacked, so he locked his gate so the men couldn't get close to his home on horseback. He burrowed a hole in a wall of his home so he could see and shoot out at anyone coming for him. He was armed with 6 loaded pistols. However, as he was preparing to fire, his wife Sally said, "Don't shoot. There are too many of them. They'll overpower you and kill you." Lewis listened, which probably saved all of their lives. While the white men were trying to break through the gate, Sally, whom Lewis described as being pretty brave throughout the raid, yelled at them that she was going to go to town to see which men were away from their homes so she could identify and report them to authorities. Lewis used this opportunity to escape. "You never saw anyone in your life go for it like I did," he explained. Lewis and Sally calculated the risks of surviving each strike and acted accordingly. Their bets paid off. The men went looking for Lewis but didn't find him. The Jacksons lived, and none of their kin were physically injured. Abe and Eliza Lyons' family wasn't as lucky. Night riders descended on Eliza and Abe Lyons' home in Choctaw County, Alabama, around 11 p.m. on June 6, 1871. The couple and their 3 children were in bed when someone knocked on their door and asked for Abe. Not thinking anything was amiss, Abe initially answered and got up. Something, perhaps a sound, his awareness of the threat the men posed, or a recollection of reports of attacks on other people in his community, so terrified Abe that he froze. Eliza testified that her husband, quote, looked like he was in a perfect scare. Abe remained in that state, forcing Eliza to act, hoping to guide her husband to safety and to protect her 3 children. The men ordered the couple to open the door and come outside. Coming out of his state of freeze for a moment, and fearing the cost of refusing to obey their commands, Abe opened the door and saw a large gang of armed men. He then returned to the trance-like state and did not move. He was so scared, Eliza said. Abe wheeled around the room, not knowing what to do. Abe's panic terrified Eliza, but she was able to remain composed enough to recognize her husband's paralysis, to close the front door, and to try to direct their escape through the rear exit. Abe came to and followed Eliza's commands, moving across the house in the dark. But when he discovered the bottom door bolted, probably by the children unbeknownst to their parents, he panicked and froze again. Eliza's hope that her husband would regain control of his senses was dashed when Abe continued to stand as though his feet were bolted to the floor. She ran behind him, intending to push him outside, but just then their attackers burst in, seized Abe, threw a rope over his head. Abe begged, "Lord, have mercy on me." After that, the men carried him away out of the house, up a hill, where they shot him and mutilated his remains. Lewis Jackson's and Eliza Lyons' descriptions of their and their spouses' behavior to strikes call into question some historians' assertions about agency in the face of white terror. African American survivors' accounts of being targeted and held hostage by night riders indicate that they faced often impossible choices: to ride out an attack or run for one's life, to defend one's family or home, or to just defend oneself, and even how to do it. Any decision could and did get people killed during night riding waves in communities. Some had no choice at all. Armed self-defense, a form of resistance privileged by many historians, wasn't always an option, and recognizing that reality could augment our understanding of Reconstruction-era violence. Survivors' testimonies are consistent with scientific research on human responses to threats to life. Neuropsychiatric research has revealed that threats to life, like inescapable attacks, activate the brain's hardwired defense mechanisms. The fact that these defense mechanisms are hardwired suggests that they could transcend historical context and give us a more accurate framework for understanding the range of possible behaviors during attacks. When the mind detects a threat to life, the brain's defense circuitry takes over, sending stress hormones from the adrenal glands to compel the body to defend itself or escape, as we saw with Lewis and with Eliza. But sometimes a person is being physically restrained and therefore incapable of escaping. Other times, pain from an earlier stage of a strike can short-circuit otherwise rational thinking. In still other instances, a person's brain or body shuts down, spacing out, becoming paralyzed by terror, which could account for Abe Lyons' behavior. The brain's hardwiring means that until the threat ends, it can only continue sending the defense signals, prompting the distribution of more hormones to elicit action. And what we know is that research on people who are scared to death shows that sometimes the emergency stress response overloads an organ, which either kills the person if that organ is the heart, it kills them in the moment, or if it's the liver or the kidneys, it kills them shortly thereafter. And that could explain numerous survivors' accounts of kin who they believe died as a result of a strike, even though they had no apparent physical injuries. Sometimes, a prior life-threatening event informs how an individual's brain and mind processes and interprets future threats. Now, histories of enslavement and survival of the late war increase the likelihood that some targets like Abe could have had a prior significant threat to life that could have triggered his freeze response to the strike. Whereas this neuropsychiatric research lends scholarly credibility to efforts to understand responses to raids, I think it's important to make clear that it essentially substantiates much of what survivors themselves said happened when they testified about attacks a century and a half ago. They just didn't have the fancy language. The issue is that some historians have accorded survivors with only selective epistemic authority over their stories of what happened to them. We appear to accept what confirms our beliefs and our principles about how we believe they should have acted, and often refuse what doesn't, which I think is a testimonial injustice. Even with Lewis Jackson's privileged position with military service, prior attacks, and his readiness to shoot back, his testimony indicates that he and Sally assessed the situation that third time and understood that they were outmanned and outgunned. Lewis could have shot at the men and even taken out a few, but the chances of him killing them all without having his family slaughtered in the process were slim. The men left after Sally's declaration and Lewis fled, apparently with her consent. The couple relocated to Huntsville, where Lewis testified. Lewis and Sally Jackson and Eliza Lyon had agency, to be sure, but the different ways each of them acted on it shows how calculative and dynamic it was. There was both a presence and absence of opportunities for people to assert their power, even within a space of a single strike. In the Blitz attack, Lewis didn't enjoy the capacity to fight back, but in the other two, he and Sally did. For families like Lewis and Sally's, power did not rest in Lewis brandishing his gun, but rather in the entire family living by any means necessary. In Eliza's case, she had the privilege of not freezing. Abe did not. Indeed, I don't believe he had choice or free will uniformly throughout the strike in terms of how he responded. Accounts like Lewis Jackson's and Eliza Lyons's contradict many assumptions we have about resistance to racist violence, which presume a universal and static possibility of choice, especially of self-defense for many historians. This appears to be born of a mix of misunderstandings of human defense mechanisms, a need for male valor, a tendency to blame people for allowing themselves to be victimized or not fighting off their attackers, and a belief in the need to steer clear of histories that invite contempt or pity for Black victimization and focus on ones that provide only usable figures. So how do I, maybe we, address scholarly recoil over responses short of armed self-defense, and what I see as a larger problem with a capital P of denial and refusal over survival strategies and articulated trauma and suffering? How do we do this while also honoring our subjects' narrated accounts and their neuroscientific and psychological research? Running away and freezing were perfectly human responses to the real threats to life that night riders pose. I don't think that Lewis and Abe were cowards, as some have suggested to me. And even if they were, in light of the pure terror so many survivors said they felt or witnessed in their kin, I don't fault them. African Americans did resist strikes, to be sure, and some of them used weapons to do so. But I agree with Vivian May that lionizing those who did can further pathologize those who could not resist in the same manner or with the same toughness of mind, spirit, and body. This is important because most targets were caught unprepared for raids. Not even those who had weapons could access them. Others had physical disabilities that made it impossible to fight back. Still others froze and succumbed to their fear and ran. Survivor stories reveal a broad spectrum of responses to being held captive. Ignoring it, I think, leads to insidious erasure of what survivors understood to be the dark, perhaps intolerable truth of strikes, their harrowing nature, the degree to which targeted people were fighting for their lives and not for some principles, and that individuals and families did whatever they could to survive them, and some couldn't do anything at all. Any choices attacked people had in surviving raids seemed diabolical, which raises the disturbing question of how much choice or agency every person had and how historians faithfully witness and truthfully represent that reality. Thank you.
Thanks again to our presenters for their outstanding presentations. We do have time for Q&A, and we have a microphone here for your use. We ask that you come to the microphone. Although I think the acoustics are pretty good, the microphone apparently is much better. So unless you really project.
So my question is for everyone, but particularly I think for Greg and Crystal. So one of the most dominant narratives of sort of emancipation and Reconstruction is about how the military was a vehicle for freedom, both practically, right? The war, emancipation happens, right? Because troops are moving into the South. It's maintained, right, by military presence, as Greg pointed out. But I just wonder, particularly for you, Crystal, how you interrogate, right, this larger narrative, because to me, what you're describing is the military as a tool for unfreedom. So I just want to, to hear your all's thoughts about sort of these larger narratives and about the role of the military in bringing about freedom, and particularly, thinking about not the fact that freedom came, but how it came about, right, as an act of war, and how that shaped, right, the experience of freedom and the way that Reconstruction perhaps played out in the late 1860s and 1870s.
Thank you for that question. Can y'all hear me? Okay. I mean, for me, it's I'm dealing with the military at a host of levels, right? And trying to understand the ways in which Black people had to kind of negotiate on the ground, whether as soldiers or as refugees in the contraband camps, or even as Black people who are in New Orleans who are free, right? This long tradition of free Black people, and then Black people who are on the plantation, right? So it's not, in some ways, what you see and what happening on the ground with the military, it fits with the kind of higher political narrative that, when troops arrive in New Orleans, freedom's not on their mind. They're not thinking about how to emancipate the slaves, right? And yet Black people understand that if they can get in Union lines, that the possibility of freedom is a reality, right? And so that has to be negotiated. And Butler is negotiating that and trying to figure that out with loyalists, right? Banks is doing that as well. Oftentimes I say Black people aren't interested in what Banks' orders are or what he's saying, that they're really sort of pushing the military to respond, whether that is for food or aid or labor or actually to literally protect their freedom, right? So the military becomes something that some Black people see as a real sort of allowing them access to certain set of rights, particularly if they're serving in the military, right? But they also understand, that it's not a given, that the military is not a given, but they understand that it is a place in which maybe they can negotiate a certain set of rights, and they do that. And you see white men, soldiers, also coming to terms and trying to grapple with what does Black freedom look like, and where they're willing to go, where they're willing to kind of allow Black people self-determination, right? And one of the things that I ultimately argue is that the military in Louisiana is really responding to black people. Like that's, you know, when they get there, that's all they can really do is really, because the refugees are so, and black people want to serve in the Army. So they are responding, and that they often use violence, coercion. If we think about the labor system that they create for black people on the plantations, a lot of that is coming out of Butler's fear that if we don't implement some kind of order, and the military can do that by policing these plantations or mustering people into service, that black people are going to sort of engage in violence and revolt. So that there's this way in which there's this tension where the military is wanting to exert authority over black people and control black people. And black people see that, but they're also trying to mobilize the military to their advantage. So one of the arguments I'm trying to say is that, you know, Reconstruction is happening, war is happening, and black people and the military are like sorting this out on the ground. And the way that they sort it out and the way that they talk about it is going to have implications for how we think about the emergence of radical Reconstruction and the fall of that, right? That a lot of the things that white military officers are saying and thinking are very much in line with how Southern Democrats think about black people and their rights and why they want to deprive them of these rights, that they're not ready for freedom, that they don't understand freedom, that they haven't actually earned it. And that is part of that discourse that's coming out of the military early on the ground, that like they're trying to figure out what is black freedom going to look like.
I think that this is a case where you know, Crystal and I think probably agree. It's always fun to answer with disagreements, but I suspect I agree with all of her answer. Because of this, to me, I would make three definitional claims. One of which is the way that I define the use of the military force doesn't fit into either of the categories you used, of a force for freedom or a force for unfreedom. The military is a force that violates normal law and procedure. In that sense, definitionally, it's going to be both, a force of freedom and a force of oppression. And that's both the possibility and the limits and the fears, the natural and correct fears of it. So in this sense, there are two sides of the same coin. A second quickly goes to the definition of freedom. I should say I have a statist vision of freedom. I don't believe in it. I do think there are inherent, in some ways this may touch upon other topics raised here. I don't believe there is an inherent tendency toward what I see as a kind of libertarianish vision of freedom that ascribes it to the individual, even in scholars who ascribe that as a kind of radical position. And I reject that. And I think that we should be highly on alert about how we, as sort of privileged bourgeois people, reimpose our sense of our sort of own investment and our autonomy backward onto figures who, you know, lack some of those privileges or structures. To me, freedom exists for me as for them in the ability to call out force to defend infringements upon me. Absent the state, there is no freedom. You know, to me, then, it is a definitionally, it necessitates a presence of state presence to achieve that kind of freedom, not an individual feeling of fulfillment, just as state presence can violate that form of freedom if the state that's called in is used to oppress. But that's the dilemma that I see that we're stuck in. So in that sense, I think it gets us past two kind of sticking points in the discussion that in the past historical discussion that don't need to be there. One of which is motivations. I actually am uninterested in the motivations of most of the occupiers. In part, this is because of the relationship, you know, that I said between how we think about the force, in part because I'm heavily influenced by other revolutionary arguments, which in fact say that a quest for sympathy of motivations is a dead end in studying how other revolutionary changes occur. That in fact the most binding commitments are often between groups that dislike each other but share a common enemy. And to that degree, in the context of other revolutionary situations, the notion of a deeply racist, you know, often violent and oppressive white northern military force that also comes to hate Confederates fits exactly within how many kind of revolutionary alliances happen. And then the second quickly is the relationship of that to another argument in the field, which is of passivity versus activity. I certainly understand the pernicious and necessary to destroy arguments about freed people's passivity, and I reject those. But in showing their actions, I think that I try to embed their actions in calls to access and gain state power. In other words, that they're highly attuned to the ways that being left alone is to be left at the hands of merciless violence. So I see their action as embedding them within state structures that they're trying to call out, and those as a dynamic rather than separate processes.
Oh, it's right here. If anyone has any questions, you feel free to line up if you'd like.
All right,
to.
so this came from Twitter, and it's for Kendada. You encourage us to look at more psychological and neuroscience, the response to trauma, and the question was, what should we be reading in order to go back there, and how, as us as scholars and historians, learn to read beyond our discipline?
Can you hear me? I think I would start with Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score. I think it's a good text that sort of looks at, it sort of brings together the psychological, the neurological, and the psychiatric research on how people respond to sexual abuse as well as physical, as well as inescapable attacks. The thing is that just like our fields have changed, the field that studies trauma has changed significantly, and I think a lot of historians have really dated understandings of trauma, or their understandings of trauma come from popular culture. So you see scholars dropping in trauma here, trauma there, but they actually haven't done any of the reading on the scholarship in trauma, which means they bring really narrow frameworks for understanding what is possible in terms of a range of responses to being held hostage. They also bring we also bring off very limited understandings of the variety of responses to a cataclysmic event. Everyone who experiences a cataclysmic event isn't traumatized by it. You have to dig a lot deeper to understand how that manifests, how that event may manifest in that person's life immediately and in the months and years thereafter. So I think that it's a good question, but I think historians have a lot of work to do. There's a lot of rich scholarship out there, and there's a book, it's a critical trauma studies reader that I think is really good. I think it's only 2 or 3 years old, so you can sort of check that out. And it approaches it from different aspects, looking at episodes of conflict, violence, sexual assault around the globe and across historical contexts.
So I have a question for Leanna, and I just want to mention that you're here not just because you're the teacher's fellow, but because you wrote a wonderful book on the Colfax Massacre. So, but my question is about your presentation today and the way you began framing democratic violence during redemption and during the 1874 Alabama elections. And you sort of posed it as, and I don't know whether you meant to frame it that way or whether it was because of the previous presentations. You framed it as a response to already violence being used as a political means, particularly by the Republican Party, going right back to the Kansas Wars in the 1850s. And I think that's actually a really interesting idea, tracing that through John Brown and the Civil War. But I'm also thinking about the way abolitionists and radical anti-slavery Republicans thought about violence, particularly in acting against slavery, including people like John Brown, who kept pointing out that they were using violence with a classic defense, that this was in self-defense for enslaved people because slavery is a state of war. And they say this in the sort of conflicts over fugitive slave renditions in the 1850s, but also in the Kansas Wars with the sort of border ruffian invasions, etc. So they are seeing themselves as reacting to what they see as the violence of the slave power, quote unquote. And I just wondered if you had thought about that a little bit, because I this kind of revisionist tendency. Oh my God, hundreds and thousands, 750,000 now we know died in the Civil War. But no one really talks about the 4 million enslaved people who are sort of experiencing violence in a day-to-day basis under slavery.
Well, I certainly think the Republican-sponsored violence is righteous, righteous violence in a good cause. And that's the most important distinction, that lets us celebrate even something as gory as the Civil War, takes on the glorious cause of emancipation. And as I'm arguing in my forthcoming book, also a lot of the other radical aspects of black liberation that we associate with Reconstruction, right, like citizenship rights, and even the move in the direction of enfranchising African American men. That these ends do actually justify extreme means. I think that black victimization and Kadada's remarks about the way blaming the victim or having contempt for the victimization of African Americans in the Reconstruction era and afterward, that actually also has an anchor in the slavery period, when at least black people complained regularly that abolitionists and others in the North, held them responsible for not having addressed their problem as slaves more often, right? That there was an aspersion on the manhood of African American men for having allowed themselves to be subjugated and their families to be subjugated. I'm not sure I'm answering your question, though, except for to say I really like the Republicans of the 19th century and that the Democrats are scum. Yeah.
Hi there. Thank you very much for this panel. This was fantastic and gave me a lot to think about. But one question I kind of selfishly came back to was, how do you teach violence during this era, both at the high school and the college level? This is obviously a really hard subject, and I'm just wondering what your experiences have been like.
Yeah, you think it's how do I teach violence? I think part of it is trying to get my students to sort of separate how they're processing their response to this violence and what our subjects are telling us. Because I think there's a tendency to conflate the two and to superimpose what we think, we feel, what we want onto these people. And I think that that's again, it's part of that testimonial injustice. It's sort of like a failed witnessing. Because at least with the sources I use, survivors are trying to communicate to a large audience, even within the sort of narrow infrastructure of the Ku Klux Klan hearings, what they believe this violence did to them. And so if you, as the student or historian, are bringing all of your own personal baggage and your thoughts and your feelings, then you're going to miss what they're trying to communicate. And I feel that that's what a lot of scholars have done. They've done very much like what the lawmakers did, which was refuse, dismiss, minimize, discredit what survivors are saying the violence did to them. And one of the things that's really interesting is that they use the active present tense. They never use the past tense. Lawmakers asking the questions, we as historians use the past tense, what this violence did to you. Survivors use the active present tense, what this violence is still doing to me, as in it's ongoing. But again, I think that part of it, so when I'm in the classroom, I try to get students to separate, create space to deal with your own personal reaction to it, and then come back to what the survivor's trying to communicate to you. And you have to provide space for both. But you can't allow your own personal thoughts, feelings, reactions to trump, at least when you're interpreting historical records, what the survivor's trying to communicate. Because when you do, you miss a lot. And I feel like historians looking at a lot of these records have missed a lot. So I try to get my students to be good witnesses, to not be failed witnesses, to not create testimonial injustice by discrediting what survivors are trying to communicate, by judging them, by holding them to an impossible standard, and by not respecting their right to tell the story of what happened to them.
Yeah, I think it's a super important question, because what I've noticed is that there's a numbness, that is invoked when you bring up the subject of violence in class. And that whereas when I first started teaching, I expected students to have the same kinds of emotional responses to violence that I had. What I found was that it was off-putting for them, and I think especially white students found a sense, they didn't always articulate it, right, but a sense of being under attack, being accused. And so I guess over the years, one thing I've moved toward is not leading those discussions about violence, but sending the students out. And what a privilege they have in their access to things like newspaper databases. So sometimes if the subject matter is heavy, I'll throw out some search terms and I'll have them spend their class day, looking at accounts in the newspapers and in other places, so that they can get that experience without being told about it.
Briefly, I think it's a great question, and there have been great answers. I think one level is about how we avoid a kind of pornography of violence that can numb, and I think Kadada's responses to that are really on point. The other is how to understand the relationship of violence in American history. Michael Zuckerman told me once that he had written out a sketch for a book called Violence in American History, and his editor sent it back with the violence in crossed out. Which is to say violence is American history, not American history is only violence. And I think there is one thing I try and teach against, is a notion, there's an intense desire among many students and sometimes among scholars to capture moments as anomalies that I think are in fact not anomalies. And I think in a way that bails us out, right? Then we say, well, Wilmington, is an anomaly as a coup. In fact, there are coups all across the 19th and early 20th century. Are coups a fundamental building block of American democracy? Are, assaults, rapes, attacks of the kinds that have been talked about here? And so that's one of the things that I want them to see it, but also to resist the idea of we're studying the one time when violence shaped, but instead that people saw it as a constitutive element of the way that the country was formed, and we have created a wish fantasy in which that's not, and then we highlight the people who violate those norms. As you can see, I don't believe that those norms exist. While it might be good if they did.
There's a line for questions, so I'm just, it's a hard question, and it's one that I turn to Greg and I say, well, that's American history. It's what it means to teach American history, and I teach a course that's called The Politics of Racial Violence in America, right? So I rely a lot on my colleagues, right? And I try to get the students to think about how power works, right? And that, that power is always about domination, and that implicit in that is violence, right? And how we think about violence in the same way, I try to get them to think in broad terms, right? That there's psychological violence, how we think about, how we talk and think about military violence is very different from how you might think about everyday violence, right? The kind of negotiations that are happening in people's daily lives, right? So I don't have a simple answer. I just can say that, it's there. I don't shy away from it with my students. I try to meet them where they are, but I don't really give them a chance to look away. And I think they know that when they take my class.
Yeah, we have 3 minutes. I figured we could quickly go through. Yeah, please.
All right. Thank you so much. This is really a really powerful panel and set of talks. And my question's for Kadada. I really loved your attention to the ways in which a overly narrow focus on agency kind of flattens the complexity of responses and the complexity of Black life and humanity, really. And I wonder if I think about these things in kind of the broader context of the history of the diaspora and what historians are doing across fields. And I wonder, I'm thinking about work of Nell Painter and Jim Downs in similar respects. And so I wonder if you have thoughts on kind of what particularly historicizing violence and African-American experiences of the post-emancipation era kind of can do for those larger questions around agency. You kind of answered it, but I'd love to hear more thoughts on kind of how the field is changing. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay.
try to be quick. I have a lot of questions, but I'll just do one. For Professor William, so obviously the sexual violence against women eroded their, sensation of their own gender identity and, well, their sense of gender roles and all that. What did they try to do to, I guess, recover that? Was it effective at all? I mean, if you can just answer that. It's a difficult question for me to ask, but.
My question's also for Dr. Williams. I think now I'm 20. We have a better understanding, I feel, in my generation of all the traumas that exist for us and the things that are traumatic, and in ways I think, in my limited knowledge of the subject, that people previously didn't quite understand. And so I wonder if in your work you discuss at all the future effects of this trauma. As we know now, PTSD is a thing in PTS. And just, I guess, how that continues through Black families and Blackness in general, and how even in like the decades just immediately to follow, and obviously even up to now, how that affects.
Okay, so I'll answer that question because we got limited time. One of the things that I'll say is that part of what I try to do is to track my survivors after they were attacked. The problem is that, I've got them when they testify at the hearing, so I learned a lot about them in one moment. But when I find them in other records, those records are much more sparse. So what I can do is, I may find them, but I may find that they've lost, that they've moved to Atlanta. They've lost all of their property, and they were landowners, and now they're panhandling, right, in Atlanta. I don't often have that much access to their interior lives unless they testify about it at the hearings. And so what I try to do with that is to use my knowledge of what happens to people who survive cataclysmic events to get a sense of how that, and what they say at the hearings, and how that might be extending out in their lives a decade or two after the fact. Again, not every person who experienced a night riding attack was traumatized by it, or had the kind of reaction that that may be linked to PTSD, right? But there are some who actually did, and that is clear through some of they didn't testify at the hearings necessarily. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they testified on behalf of their loved ones who they account for. They are not the same. They don't go into extensive detail about what's wrong with them, but they are distressed by the distress that their loved ones are experiencing after the attack. And so part of what I try to do is to sort of think through work like Saidiya Hartman's in terms of critical fabulation. Just imagine what is a range of possibilities without ascribing a lot of specific detail to certain people, because again, I don't know. And what you learn when you read the scholarship on trauma and coming out of psychology and psychiatry is that it's really difficult to generalize. It's problematic to generalize, especially when you don't have the details of their lives. So I try to be very careful and be really transparent about what may be happening with some of my subjects and what may have happened to them after the fact. The problem is that tracking them over time becomes more difficult after the hearings. And 2 decades after the hearings, I may be able to find a lot of people in 1880, but I find, the 1890 census, a large portion of it was destroyed. Sometimes I can find people in the state census. So there's this one couple, Samuel and Hannah Tutson. She's raped, and this is related to the other question. She's sexually assaulted during the attack on her family. And there are scholars who've read the testimonies and think about the way that her husband talked about the way she was sexually violated, thinking that that he is distancing himself from her. They are together in Florida in 1885, right? Now, I don't know what their lives look like, what their interior lives look like. I just know that they are together. And I have to be honest about and sort of sitting with it and accepting that I don't have the detail to fill in. But I'm okay with that. Because again, that's part of what the scholarship on trauma, it sort of takes away the safety net. You have to get over your own need to fill in those gaps, and you have to accept what you find in the archive and imagine the range of possibilities. And so it's difficult work, and everyone doesn't have the discipline to do it, but I feel like we've got the sort of guideposts for what can be done. And it still leaves a lot up in the air, but I still think it's valuable work to do. and to consider.
Mind if I respond to the sexual violence
do. Thank you.
question? You know, for me, in terms of thinking about, I know somebody asked a question about sexual violence and thinking about the sort of long-term implications of that kind of systematic sexual assault on Black women from slavery through Reconstruction. And there are scholars who, like Evelyn Higginbotham, if you've read, or Darlene Clark Hines' work, where they sort of talk about those sort of long-term consequences and how it shapes Black women's politics, right, in the post-war period. So the politics of respectability that comes out of that longer history, and how Black women are grappling and dealing with that trauma, right, in some ways. And I try, even in my first book with Southern Horrors, with thinking about Southern white women and how they experience the trauma of war and occupation, that I say that you can see how that plays out in their sort of the rape lynch myth of the post-war period, that trauma is being worked out in interesting and problematic ways, that it just doesn't go away, that it becomes a part of how people negotiate new relationships in that post-war period. So I don't know where you went, but that was one way I would kind of think about that in my own work, sort of thinking about the larger sort of political implications, because sometimes it's harder to get to some of the more intimate tracking what that means for individual women. It's much harder to do sometimes, but you can think about the impact on the larger community and how they mobilize that shared trauma.
Well, we are at our time. Thank you so much for attending. I'd like to thank our panelists.